The final candle in the great archive has been lit. The dust of 1,000 years brushed softly away. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone. The noisy world outside these stone walls is gone, making room for the quiet stillness of time. Let your breath slow and follow the ancient ink glowing in the firelight. Here, in the deepest and most sheltered alcove of the library, where the stone floor is worn smooth from countless centuries of slow, unhurried footsteps, and where the walls themselves seem to exhale a kind of cool, mineral patience, there is a particular manuscript that I have returned to again and again across the long and unhurried centuries of my keeping. It is not the thickest volume on these shelves, nor the most ornate. Its cover is simple, dark, worn almost featureless by the oils of many careful hands, and it carries no title that you could read in a single glance. But when you hold it close to the flickering warmth of the lamp, when the amber light catches the grain of the old leather and the faint impressions of lettering long since softened into suggestion rather than declaration, you begin to feel something settle inside you, a heaviness, a loosening of the careful, waking architecture of the mind. And that, dear traveler resting here beside my lamp, is entirely fitting, because this old, quiet book is about the one who shaped every dream you have ever drifted into, and every dream that has ever found its way into you. His name is Morpheus, and his story begins not with thunder, not with light, not with any of the grand, blazing proclamations of the Olympian gods, whose golden tales fill so many of these other shelves. His story begins, as all truly ancient things do, in the dark. The ancient Greeks, those careful and meticulous observers of the inner life, understood something about dreams that we, in our busy and illuminated era, have perhaps grown too distracted to remember. They understood that a dream is not a thing that happens inside you. A dream is a visitor. A dream arrives. It crosses a great and shadowed distance to find you in your sleep, and it carries something, a message, a shape, a feeling that lingers in the hollow of the chest long after the morning light has dissolved the last traces of its architecture. These visitors, these sovereign and purposeful entities of the night, were known in the Greek tradition as the Oneiroi, the personified spirits of the dream realm. And they were, in the cosmological understanding of that ancient world, among the oldest things in existence. Because to understand who the Oneiroi were, and to understand the one who stood above them all, you must first understand from where they came. And they did not come from Olympus. They did not descend from Zeus or Hera, or any of the bright and tempestuous gods of the high places. The Oneiroi were the children of Nyx, the personification of night itself, and Erebus, the primordial, formless darkness that preceded even the gods of the visible world. Hesiod, the old poet whose words I have kept safe in this archive for longer than most civilizations have existed, wrote of these origins with a kind of reverent awe, as if even the act of naming these elder forces required a slowing of breath and a lowering of the voice. Nyx, he described, was one of the very first things to exist, a vast, feathered, absolute darkness that wrapped itself around the newborn universe before stars had been imagined, before the concept of a horizon had been conceived. She moved through the earliest cosmos like a slow tide, and from her came things that the morning could not explain. Fear, sleep, old age, and the Oneiroi, the dreams. There is something deeply comforting in that genealogy when you hold it quietly for a moment in the amber warmth of this library. It means that dreams are not accidents. They are not the random debris of an exhausted brain. They are as old as the darkness between stars. They have the same parents as sleep itself, and they have been traveling towards sleeping minds since long before the first city was built, since long before the first name was spoken aloud into the listening ear. The Oneiroi, in the earliest accounts, were a vast multitude, possibly as many as 1,000 unnamed spirits, drifting outward from the shadowed realm of their parents, carrying visions prophetic and meaningless, vast and trivial, terrible and profoundly gentle. They moved like smoke through the night air, slipping beneath the doors of palaces and hovels alike, settling over sleeping figures with the soft, deliberate weight of a heavy cloak being draped across tired shoulders. They asked nothing of the sleeper. They only offered the dream, and then withdrew. But it was the Roman poet Ovid, writing in a later and more architecturally minded age, who gave order to this vast and drifting multitude. In his great work, The Metamorphoses, a book whose very title breathes with the concept of transformation, Ovid drew 3 figures forward from the nameless swarm and named them, assigned them specific territories and specific natures, and in doing so, created a framework that would echo forward through millennia of thought. At the head of this triad stood Morpheus. His name comes from the Greek word morphe, meaning form or shape, and this etymology was not decorative. It was a precise description of his divine power and his singular domain. Morpheus was the master of the human form. He could assume the appearance of any person, the exact cast of their features, the precise weight and rhythm of their walk, the particular timbre and cadence of their voice, with such flawless, seamless accuracy that a dreaming mind could not detect the substitution. He was not merely a messenger. He was an actor of such complete and devoted craft that the performance became, for the duration of the dream, indistinguishable from reality itself. Below him in the triad were his 2 brothers, each governing a separate and distinct province of the sleeping mind. Phobetor, who was also sometimes called Icolos, the one whose very name carries the echo of fear, took the form of animals and beasts when he visited the dreams of ordinary mortals. He was the architect of nightmares, of the primal and wordless terrors that arrive on 4 legs or on silent wings, that make the sleeping body pull itself smaller beneath the bedclothes. And then there was Phantasis, the strangest of the 3, who manifested not as people or creatures, but as inanimate things, as the earth, as water, as stone and root and wood, and the shifting surfaces of the world itself. He was the bringer of surreal visions, the constructor of those dreams where geography is wrong and rooms lead into impossible other rooms, and the sky is the wrong color, and nothing quite follows the laws that waking life insists upon. But it was Morpheus who held the highest station. And this was not merely a matter of hierarchy for hierarchy's sake. The ancient understanding was quite specific and quite deliberate about why he stood above his brothers. Morpheus's gift, his terrifying and exquisite gift, was reserved for a particular kind of dreamer. He visited kings, he visited heroes, he visited the gods themselves in the rare and solemn moments when the divine required communication with the divine through the medium of sleep. Because when the highest of Olympus needed a message delivered to a mortal ruler, when fate needed to bend the arc of history through a whispered word in the dark of a bedchamber, Morpheus was dispatched. He would descend through the velvet layers of the night, assume the shape of a trusted advisor, a beloved parent, a familiar voice from the sleeper's waking life, and deliver the vision with the absolute, unquestionable conviction of something real. The visions crafted by Morpheus were not riddles wrapped in ambiguity the way the pronouncements of oracles so often were. They did not require translation. They did not arrive in symbols that needed the interpretation of priests and scholars. They arrived as experience. The sleeper did not see a dream about the thing. The sleeper lived it, breathed it, felt the weight of it in their chest, the texture of it against their skin, and woke with the certainty that what they had experienced was as solid and as true as the waking world. This was the particular genius and the particular danger of what Morpheus could do. He shaped events not through force or proclamation, but through the gentle, invisible architecture of belief. He planted a thought in the mind of a king, and kingdoms turned. He delivered a sorrow to a queen, and the whole geography of grief shifted. And all of it happened in the dark, in the silence, while the world slept. Here in the archive, I find myself resting my hand flat against the cool surface of this old manuscript, feeling the slight roughness of the aged parchment beneath my palm, and thinking of all the sleeping figures across all the centuries who lay beneath their cloaks and furs and linens, unaware that in the darkness above them, an ancient and patient intelligence was assembling the architecture of their next experience. There is something in that image that dissolves the separations we usually maintain between the past and the present, between the mythological and the neurological, between what the ancients believed and what we know. Because wherever you are now, whatever the year, the same darkness pools in the corners of the room. The same heaviness gathers in the limbs. The same slow tide of sleep moves toward the shore of consciousness, patient and inevitable, and very, very old. The Oneiroi are still out there, somewhere in the long genealogy of night. Perhaps they are not what Ovid imagined them to be. Perhaps they are something the poets had not yet found the words for. But the dreams still come, don't they? They still arrive in the dark, carrying their particular cargo of images and feelings and half-remembered voices, and they still ask only one thing of the sleeper: let go. Let the waking architecture soften. Let the careful, precise, daylight version of the self grow quiet and still, the way the library grows quiet in the deep of the night, when even the candles seem to breathe more slowly, and the stone walls hold the silence like cupped hands holding something precious and fragile and endlessly old. The lamp is low now. The parchment rests open, its ancient script catching the last warm tremors of the light. And somewhere beyond these walls, beyond the hush of this keeping place, the first of the Oneiroi drifts outward from the shadows, carrying the shape of something you have almost forgotten, carrying it toward you, slowly, slowly. The candle has burned a little lower since we last rested here together. The pool of light it casts has grown smaller, warmer, more amber, drawing the edges of the room closer, wrapping the shelves and their patient cargo of manuscripts in a soft and welcoming shadow that feels less like darkness and more like a kind of presence, a gentle, attending stillness that has no intention of disturbing anything. The stone floor beneath these old sandals holds the coolness of deep earth, and the air carries the familiar smell of this place, the dry mineral whisper of aged papyrus, the faint sweetness of lamp oil, the deeper, heavier note of binding leather and old wood, and the accumulated quiet of centuries piled softly upon centuries. I have set the manuscript aside for a moment, and I have been sitting very still, simply listening to the silence. Because there is a particular quality to the silence of this archive at this hour, when the last of the daytime world has drained away completely, and even the notion of the outside has become theoretical, a thing one remembers rather than senses. In that silence, the pages seem to breathe, the ink seems to glow, and the stories held inside these volumes seem to loosen from the words that contain them and drift, slowly and without urgency, into the air of the room itself. And so it is that the story of Morpheus continues tonight, not with battles or pronouncements, but with something far quieter and far older. It continues with a place. Long before Morpheus could go anywhere, before he could shape himself into a trusted face and carry his cargo of meaning into the mind of a sleeping king, he had to come from somewhere. He had to have a home, a point of origin, a place where the dream was assembled before it was dispatched into the world. And the ancient poets, those careful cartographers of invisible geography, knew exactly where that place was. It was a cave. But to call it simply a cave is to use a word far too ordinary for what it actually was. Ovid, in his Metamorphoses, devoted careful and loving attention to describing this place, the home of Somnus, the god of sleep, who was the father of Morpheus and the guardian of the dream realm. He described it as if he had been there himself, as if he had stood in its entrance and felt the particular atmosphere of the place settle over him like a cloak of the finest, heaviest wool. And reading his description in this archive by candlelight, with the silence already doing its patient work on the edges of wakefulness, it is not difficult to understand why. The cave was located near the land of the Sumeri, a people who in ancient belief lived in perpetual darkness, in a place where the sun never reached the ground, where the concept of noon and midnight were the same grey, undifferentiated twilight. The cave was tucked deep into the hollow of a mountain at the end of a long and gradually descending path, and from the moment you began descending toward it, the quality of the light changed. It softened. It lost its edges. The shadows grew thicker, not menacing, but muffling the way deep water muffles sound, absorbing it gently and replacing it with a slower, more fundamental quiet. The cave itself existed, Ovid wrote, in a state of eternal, doubtful twilight, a phrase so precisely beautiful that I have never been able to read it without pausing to hold it quietly for a moment. Doubtful twilight. Not darkness, not light, but the threshold between them, the moment that cannot decide which way it will fall, and so remains perpetually, gracefully suspended. The sun, at morning, at noon, at evening, was entirely forbidden from penetrating within. Thick vapors moved through the interior of the space like slow, soft exhalations, and the air was neither cold nor warm, but something more neutral than either, a temperature that the body registered not as sensation, but as an absence of sensation, which is perhaps the nearest the waking world ever comes to the feeling of perfect rest. And then there was the silence. Ovid was very precise about the silence, because it was not merely the absence of sound. It was an architecture in itself. It was built. It was maintained by very specific omissions, each one deliberate, each one essential to the whole. There were no doors at the entrance to this cave. No hinges, no latches, no wood or stone that might creak or groan or announce the passage of something through. The threshold was open, always open, but somehow sealed against disturbance by the sheer depth of the quiet within. There was no guardian at the gate, no hound, no keeper, no watchman pacing the entrance with a restless step. The cave did not need to be defended, because nothing that required defending ever existed there. Within the cave, no wakeful rooster called the hour. No dogs gave alarm. No wild creature stirred or cried in the surrounding dark. The wind, if it reached this place at all, lost its ambition well before the entrance and arrived, if it arrived, as nothing more than the faintest pressure against the cheek, barely distinguishable from stillness. Even the trees nearby, Ovid noted with the attention of someone who understood that silence is fragile and must be protected from every direction, grew without making a sound. Their branches did not creak, their leaves did not rustle. They simply existed, as patient and mute as the stone walls of this archive on a night like this one, when the world has grown very far away, and even the concept of noise seems like something that happened a long time ago, in a place one has mostly forgotten. The only permitted sound, the single auditory element that Ovid allowed into this sanctuary of absolute quiet, was the river Lethe, and even that sound was barely a sound at all. The Lethe, the river of forgetfulness, the water that dissolved the memories of the dead before their passage into the next existence, trickled here over a bed of small, smooth pebbles, and produced, as it did so, a low whisper, a sound so close to silence that the two could barely be distinguished from each other, a sound designed not to interrupt the quiet, but to reinforce it, the way the faint crackle of this candle flame makes the surrounding silence feel deeper rather than broken. Here in the archive, I find a particular sympathy with that image of the whispering Lethe, because there is something that water moving over stone at night does to a listening mind. It does not invite the attention to focus. It invites the attention to soften, to spread out like candlelight on a wide, dark surface, to stop insisting on the sharp edges of things and let them blur, gently, naturally, the way ink blurs in humid air, the way the features of a sleeping face soften and become something more fundamental than the waking version of themselves. And at the center of the cave, on a bed of black ebony, covered in a counterpane described as dusky, soft, dark as the space between stars, the god Somnus lay perpetually at rest. Around him drifted the somnia, the dream forms, in their countless shapes and variations, moving through the thick, vaporous air of the cave, like the slow turning of a wheel, patient and purposeful, and entirely without urgency. Morpheus among them, waiting, gathering the shape he would need, assembling the voice, the weight, the precise and particular human architecture of the form he would assume, and then drifting upward, upward through the drowsy air, upward through the cave and the twilight and the poppied darkness at the entrance, and outward into the sleeping world. But leaving the cave was not a simple matter of choosing a direction and departing. There was a threshold to cross. There was, in the ancient understanding, a boundary between the dream realm and the waking world that was architectural in nature, that took a very specific and deeply symbolic form. 2 gates. And the choice of gate was everything. The gates of horn and ivory appear first in Homer's Odyssey, in a scene of such quiet and intimate poignancy that it has stayed in this archive's deepest memory since the scroll was first unrolled here, centuries ago by candlelight, very much like this one. Queen Penelope, alone in her long-suffering patience, speaks of these gates in conversation with a stranger, a traveller she does not recognize, who is, in fact, her long-lost husband, returned in disguise. She is describing a dream she has had, and she speaks of it with a kind of weary tenderness, as if dreams are letters from a country she can no longer reach. She explains that all dreams must pass through one of 2 gates before they reach the dreaming mind. True dreams, prophetic dreams, visions that carry the weight of what will actually come to pass, these travel through the gate of horn. The gate is described as made from the material of actual animal horn, which is translucent, through which a careful eye can perceive, dimly but truly, what lies on the other side. It lets the light through. It allows the seeing, imperfectly but honestly. False dreams, illusions, visions that feel real but carry no truth, that promise what will never come, that simulate a future that will not arrive, these pass through the gate of ivory. And ivory, beautiful as it is, dense and gleaming and perfectly white, is opaque. It reflects. It does not transmit. It shows you yourself, polished and magnified, and nothing beyond. The ancient architectural logic of this boundary is so precise, so quietly devastating in its implications, that one could spend a long winter evening beside this lamp, simply turning it over in the mind. Horn sees through. Ivory reflects back. Truth passes through the transparent. Deception emerges from the beautiful surface that reveals nothing of what lies behind it. But here is the part that Penelope understood, and that she spoke of with that note of quiet despair that has never entirely left these pages in all the centuries I have kept them. The sleeper has no way to know which gate their dream came through. None. They wake with the vision still warm and vivid in their chest, still carrying the emotional conviction of something real and meaningful, and they have no instrument, no tool, no mechanism of discernment that can tell them whether what they received was truth arriving through the translucent horn, or beautiful, convincing deception delivered through the gleaming ivory. They can only hold it gently and hope. Virgil, the Roman poet, returned to these gates in his Aeneid in one of the strangest and most debated moments in all of ancient literature. His hero Aeneas, having completed his long and solemn tour of the underworld, having walked through the realms of the dead and received the great prophecy of Rome's future from his father's ghost, is sent back to the living world by his father through the gate of ivory, the gate of false dreams, and scholars have argued the meaning of this choice ever since. Was it an error? Was it a statement about the nature of all visions, even the most prophetic? Was it a quiet acknowledgement that the boundary between truth and deception is not as fixed as the architecture of two gates implies? Here in the archive, I have set down my small lamp beside the manuscript, and I am simply resting in the company of these questions, not pressing them for answers, because some questions are not locks requiring keys, but doors that open onto the most comfortable rooms in the house of thought, rooms where you can sit for a long time without needing to do anything at all. The gates of horn and ivory. I find myself imagining them in the darkness at the back of this room, two tall archways set into the ancient stone. One faintly luminous, with the particular amber translucency of old horn held up to a low light. The other gleaming white and smooth as a polished surface, reflecting the candle flame back at itself, doubling it, making it seem to float in the darkness, a small and steady warmth. And somewhere beyond both of them, At the far end of a long and gradually descending passage, the cave is breathing. The lethe is whispering over its pebbles. The vapors are moving in their slow, patient circles. The darkness is the soft, absolute darkness of a place where even the concept of urgency has long since dissolved and settled to the floor like the finest dust. And you, traveller, resting here beside this candle, you are already closer to that place than you were a moment ago. The listening is doing its quiet work. The story is doing its quiet work. The darkness beyond the lamp is growing softer rather than deeper, warmer rather than colder, more like a familiar room than an absence. There is nothing required of you now, nothing to hold on to, nothing to keep track of, no gate to identify, no dream to interpret. Only the slow, warm drift of a story that has been told and kept safe in this archive for 3,000 years. Still moving, still breathing, still finding its way through the dark toward the sleeping minds that need it. The candle murmurs. The stone is cool and patient all around, and the dream is already on its way. The hour has grown very deep now, deeper than before, deeper than the part of the night that still holds any memory of evening, deeper even than the middle watches, when the city beyond these walls turns in its sleep and sighs and settles. This is the hour that has no name in any language I have found in all these shelves. The hour that exists between the last conscious thought and the first unconscious one. The hour when the archive itself seems to breathe more slowly, when the flame of this candle pulls itself down to its most essential self, a small, warm, trembling core of amber light, surrounded by a darkness that feels not empty, but full. Full of the slow, accumulated quiet of everything that has ever been thought, or dreamed, or whispered into the listening ear of this room. I have been sitting very still. My hands are folded on the open manuscript. The stone of the walls carries its ancient coolness outward into the room, like a long, slow exhalation. And the smell of the place at this hour is particular and irreplaceable, the deepest note of old leather, the mineral patience of the floor, the faint, warm sweetness of the lamp oil burning down to its last, careful reserve. There is nowhere else. There has never been anywhere else. There is only this room, and this light, and the story that continues to drift through the amber air like smoke from a candle that has been burning for 3,000 years. And the story has arrived at a threshold. Not the gates of horn and ivory, though those ancient doorways are still visible, faintly, in the deepest part of the memory this narrative has been building. No, this is a different kind of threshold. This is the place where the outer world, the world of gods and caves and mythological gates, folds quietly inward and becomes the world inside. The gods, as centuries accumulated and empires rose and settled slowly into dust, did not disappear. They never disappear. They simply change address. They move from the temples into the texts. They move from the texts into the mind. And it was a Swiss physician named Carl Jung, working in the long, lamplit evenings of the early 20th century, who first articulated with clinical precision what the ancient Greeks had always understood intuitively, that Morpheus was not only out there, drifting through the dark on borrowed human faces. Morpheus was in here. He had always been in here. Jung was a careful man, a meticulous and deeply patient observer of the inner life, and he spent decades listening to the dreams and symptoms and inexplicable behaviors of his patients with the same quality of attention that I have always tried to bring to the manuscripts in this archive. The understanding that everything means something, that nothing that persists does so accidentally, that the patterns which repeat themselves across time and across individuals are pointing towards something real and structural, something that was there before the person arrived and will be there after they have gone. What Jung found in the depths of that listening was an architect, an inner architect, a presence within the psyche that assembled the nightly architecture of dreams not randomly, but purposefully, not carelessly, but with the specific intention of confronting the conscious mind with whatever it had chosen not to see in the daylight hours. He called it the complex, and in a formulation that stops the breath when you encounter it in the pages of his collected writings, he described the complex as precisely that, the architect of dreams and of symptoms. Sigmund Freud, his elder and his teacher, and eventually his most significant intellectual parting, had declared that the dream was the royal road to the unconscious, a grand and illuminated highway, paved and direct. But Jung, with the gentleness of someone who has walked a great many paths and found most of them less straightforward than they appeared, amended this. The road, he said, is not royal. The road is a rough and uncommonly devious footpath that often loses itself in the undergrowth. It winds, it doubles back, it passes beside the unconscious, rather than directly through its heart. And the one who built that path, who laid its strange and winding course through the interior landscape, was the complex, the inner Morpheus, working quietly and without permission in the shadows of the self. The complexes, as Jung described them with such patient clinical care, are not simple things. They accumulate slowly over the years of a life, gathering themselves around certain deep and universal patterns that he called archetypes. The mother, the father, the child, the shadow, the figures that appear in every mythology of every culture that has ever existed, because they are not cultural constructions, but structural ones, built into the architecture of the human mind, the way load-bearing walls are built into a house, the way the cave was built into the mountain, present before the occupant arrived and remaining after they have gone. When these complexes are activated, they do not announce themselves politely. They do not wait for permission or for a convenient moment. They arrive with an emotional weight that seems disproportionate to whatever small event triggered them. A flash of inexplicable anger, a sadness with no visible source, a fear that visits the same room of the mind over and over, rearranging the furniture slightly each time, but never quite leaving. And in sleep, they build. They construct the elaborate and visceral architecture of the dream with the same patient, purposeful craft that Morpheus brought to his impersonations of the dead king, appearing before the sleeping queen with every detail rendered perfectly, every texture and weight and quality of voice so precisely accurate that the dreaming mind receives the experience not as symbol, but as fact. Jung described these complexes with a precision that carries its own kind of poetry as splinter psyches, fragmentary personalities residing within the host, possessing their own laws, their own survival mechanisms, their own agendas that run parallel to and sometimes directly counter to the conscious intentions of the waking self. They are, he observed, relatively autonomous. They do not answer to the ego. They operate in the shadow, in the doubtful twilight of the inner cave, and they shape the dream the way Morpheus shaped the appearance of the drowned king, with complete fidelity to an emotional truth that the dreamer's waking mind has refused to acknowledge. Here in the archive, I find this convergence quietly astonishing, even after all the centuries I have spent in the company of these ideas. That the ancient Greeks, working only with observation and imagination and the particular quality of attention that comes from living in a world that takes the inner life as seriously as the outer one, arrived at something so structurally similar to what a 20th century physician would discover by listening to the dreams of his patients for 40 years. The architect was always there. The cave was always inside the mountain. The Oneiroi were always also complexes, always also the autonomous inner architects of the nightly dreamscape, building their elaborate and necessary constructions in the dark for the same purpose they had always served: to bring the sleeping mind into contact with what the waking mind most needed to know. And then, as the centuries continued their slow, patient turning, something else happened. The inner world that Jung had mapped with such careful clinical precision found its way into narrative, into story, into the sprawling, luminous, deeply serious work of artists who understood that mythology is not history. Mythology is a living language, and it needed new speakers. Neil Gaiman was one such speaker. In a long and richly imagined series of illustrated narratives, he gave Morpheus a new home, a new title, and a cosmological scope that would have delighted the ancient poets. He called him Dream of the Endless. And the endless were not gods in any familiar sense. They were older than gods, They were the personifications of the most fundamental forces of existence itself, more ancient even than the Olympians, more permanent than any theology, because they existed as long as there were minds to dream, or to desire, or to despair. Morpheus, in Gaiman's telling, was the ruler and architect of a place called the Dreaming, an entire metaphysical realm as vast and various as imagination itself, to which all sleeping minds travelled when they closed their eyes, regardless of species, regardless of century, regardless of whether they remembered it in the morning. He had carved its gates himself, those same 2 gates of horn and ivory, drawing the ancient Homeric architecture into the foundation of his new domain. And the dreaming was his creation, and his responsibility and his reflection, so deeply symbiotic with his nature that when he was captured and imprisoned for a century, the realm did not merely fall silent, it began to come apart. Its structure grew uncertain, its inhabitants faded or wandered or forgot what they were. Because the dreaming, in Gaiman's understanding, was not a place that existed independently of its architect. It was a continuous act of making. It required his presence, his attention, his ongoing creative will, the way this archive requires the lamp to be lit each night, the way a living language requires speakers, the way a dream requires the sleeping mind to receive it. Without Morpheus, the dreaming was not empty. It was unmade, and upon his return, he found the slow, patient work of reconstruction waiting for him, requiring centuries of careful tending before the realm recovered its former coherence and depth. Gaiman also introduced something the ancient texts had only implied: the tragedy of the architect, who cannot change what he has built within himself. Because the dreaming could be reconstructed, reshaped, expanded. But Morpheus, for all his power over the malleable substance of imagination, was himself rigid. He was ancient and absolute, and unwilling to bend in the ways that living things must bend in order to continue living. And so, in the quiet and devastating conclusion of Gaiman's long narrative, the Lord of Dreams made the only change available to him. He transformed, and his power and his title passed to a mortal child, who became the new dream, carrying the ancient office into a new form, a new century, a new understanding of what the architecture of the inner life might become. The Lord of Dreams learns that one must change or die. Gaiman described the arc of the entire narrative in those words, and I have read them many times here in the lamplight, turning them slowly in the mind, the way you turn a smooth stone in the hand, feeling the particular weight and temperature of it. One must change or die. Even the architect of all dreams, even the one who has been building since before the gods had names. And then there was another story, from another era, from a medium that the ancient Greeks could not have imagined but would, I think, have recognized in the deepest structural sense. A film, a vision crafted from light and shadow and the concentrated imagination of 2 sisters who had spent their lives in the company of mythology and philosophy, and the strange, urgent question of what is real. In The Matrix, the character named Morpheus moved through a world that was itself a dream, a perfect and elaborate simulation of a reality that had long since been destroyed, maintained by machines for reasons of pure systemic efficiency, and inhabited by sleeping humans who believed entirely in its textures and temperatures and the convincing weight of its objects against their hands. He was played as a man of absolute, unshaking faith, quiet and deliberate and certain in the way that only someone who has already passed through the gate of horn can be certain. Someone who knows, with the particular knowledge that cannot be argued with, what is real and what only appears to be. The mythological duality of the gates was translated in this story into a choice. A pill of blue, a pill of red. The blue is the river Lethe, offered willingly. Take it and forget everything you have glimpsed beyond the comfortable surface. Return to the warm and beautifully opaque gate of ivory. Continue dreaming within the dream. The red is the gate of horn, translucent, allowing the seeing through, but what it reveals is harsh and cold and demands everything of the one who chooses it. Morpheus, in this telling, was a liberator, but also in the precise philosophical symmetry that the story maintained so carefully. He was also the one who, from the perspective of those still inside the system, plunged the awakened into a darker and more terrible sleep than the one they had been living. Because reality, when you have spent your entire life inside a simulation, feels like the most disorienting dream of all. He stood at the boundary between two kinds of unconsciousness and offered the one that led toward truth, knowing that truth is rarely comfortable and that the cave of the real is colder and darker and less furnished than the cave of the beautifully constructed illusion. And across from him, within the architecture of the simulated world, sat another figure, not named Morpheus, but carrying the title that Morpheus had always embodied: the architect. Cold, mathematical, precise. The designer and maintainer of the elaborate constructed reality. The one who had built the gates and set the rules and calibrated the precise balance of acceptable misery that would keep the dreaming population quiescent and convinced. Two versions of the same ancient archetype, separated by philosophy and purpose. One who built the dream to contain, one who dismantled the dream to liberate. Here in the archive, the candle has burned very low. The light it casts now is the warmest and most intimate it has been all evening. A small amber circle that barely reaches the edges of the desk, that leaves the shells and their patient cargo in a deep and comfortable shadow. The manuscripts are sleeping, if manuscripts can be said to sleep, which, after all these centuries of their company, I believe they can. The stone walls are breathing their slow mineral breath. The silence has the quality that only arrives at the deepest hours, when even memory grows quieter, when the precise edges of things soften, and the mind stops insisting on the difference between what it is thinking and what it is feeling, and what it is drifting toward. You have travelled a long way tonight, through mythologies and caves and the inner architecture of the dreaming mind, through comic cosmologies and cinematic simulations, and the slow, patient clinical observations of a physician who understood that the gods never leave, they only move inward. And through all of it, through every era and every medium and every language in which this archetype has found its voice, the essential truth of Morpheus has remained the same. He is the one who shapes the experience of sleep. He is the patient, purposeful architect of the nightly journey inward. He has been at this work since before the first city, since before the first text, since before the first name was given to the darkness from which his mother was made. And he is very close now. He has been close for a while. The lamp is murmuring its last warm breath. The archive is perfectly still. The candle has reached its final hour. The flame is very small now, very close to the surface of the wax, burning with a steadiness that seems less like combustion and more like a kind of quiet resolve, the determination of something that has been alight for a long time and knows, without urgency, without distress, that it is approaching its rest. The circle of warmth it casts has drawn itself in to the most intimate possible radius, a small, amber, breathing presence on the surface of the desk. And beyond its edges, the archive has become indistinguishable from the darkness it has always contained within its walls. That deep, mineral, protective darkness that is not emptiness, but fullness, not absence, but presence. The accumulated quiet of 3,000 years of careful keeping. My hands are folded on the closed manuscript now. The story is nearly complete, not because it has reached an ending, because the story of Morpheus has no ending. It will be told again tomorrow, in some other form, in some other medium, by some other voice that does not yet know it is carrying an archetype as old as the first sleeping mind. But because the hour has grown so deep, and the telling has brought us to the place where words begin to loosen their grip on meaning, and the meaning begins to drift free, slowly, like the pages of an old book left open in a gentle current of air, turning on their own, without hurry, without destination. There is one last chamber in this long and wandering archive of the dream. One final room where the story of Morpheus has arrived in our own era, in the work of those who have translated the mythological and the psychological into something as physical and as measurable as space itself. As walls, as thresholds, as the particular experience of a body moving through a built world and feeling that world press back against it with its own accumulated meanings. Architects, in the most recent decades of the long century just past, began to speak of dreams not as metaphors for their work, but as methodologies within it. They began to ask, with the precise and curious attention of people who build things that other people must inhabit, what the logic of the dream could teach the logic of the built space. Not the content of dreams, not the specific images or narratives, but the structural principles by which dreams organize experience. The way familiar elements appear in unfamiliar configurations. The way scale shifts without announcement. The way one room opens into another that should not be adjacent and yet is. The way the body in a dream moves through space with a different relationship to gravity and geometry than the waking body maintains. They called this investigation, in the particular and quietly beautiful language of academic architecture, the dreamscape. And at the centre of their inquiry was the same figure who has always stood at the centre of any serious engagement with the nature of the interior life. Morpheus, understood now not as a person, not as a god, not as a psychological complex or a cinematic hero, but as an operation, a process, a verb rather than a noun. Morpheus, in this contemporary architectural understanding, is a design that travels. It is a fluid construct that does not rest on any static surface, but moves continuously through shifting parameters, the way the god himself moved through the dark between the cave and the sleeping mind, assuming shape and form not because he had a fixed nature, but because the destination required a particular architecture, and he provided it. The dream, in this framework, is not a picture. It is a built environment, and built environments can be studied, and their principles can be extracted, and those principles can be applied to the design of physical spaces in the waking world. The method they developed has a name drawn from the practice of model makers and craftspeople who work with fragments. Kit bashing, the assembling of entirely new forms from the disparate pieces of existing ones, taking components that were designed for separate purposes and separate contexts, and finding in their combination a new spatial logic that neither component possessed alone. This is precisely how the dream builds its architecture. It takes the staircase from a house you lived in as a child and places it inside a building you visited once for an afternoon, and the result is a space that is both deeply familiar and completely impossible, that the dreaming mind inhabits without question, because the emotional logic is consistent, even when the physical logic is not. And there is something in this method, something in the patient and playful and deeply serious practice of assembling new territories from old fragments, that carries the warmth of recognition when you sit with it here in the lamplight. Because this archive is also an act of kit bashing. These shelves hold fragments from 1,000 different contexts, 1,000 different centuries and languages and intellectual traditions, and the work of the keeper, The work I have been doing in these stone rooms for longer than I can precisely account is to find in the combination of those fragments a spatial logic, a navigable territory, a place where a travelling mind can rest and find its bearings and feel, despite the vast strangeness of everything it has passed through, entirely at home. Michel de Certeau, a philosopher who thought carefully about the relationship between bodies and spaces, and the living dynamic process by which ordinary people create their own geographies simply by moving through the world, wrote of walking as a kind of writing. The foot traces a path through the city, and the path is a text, and the text creates a territory that did not exist before the walking began. Morpheus, in the architectural interpretation, does something similar. He walks through the available fragments of a life, a memory, an unconscious accumulation of spaces and textures and temperatures and half-remembered geometries. And his walking creates the territory of the dream, a prime map generated by the procedural logic of a mind that does not, in sleep, observe the usual courtesies of physics and proportion. And here, in the deepest room of this particular inquiry, something extraordinary happens. The biological and the architectural and the mythological converge into a single, quiet, luminous idea. The process by which organisms develop their physical forms, the process called morphogenesis, which carries in its name the same root that gave Morpheus his morphe, form, shape, is understood by the most careful contemporary researchers to be, in some fundamental and still not entirely articulated sense, a cognitive process. The body, as it builds itself, is thinking. Not in the way the conscious mind thinks, not with language or intention or the particular linear logic of the waking day, but with a deep, structural, pattern-recognizing intelligence that operates below the threshold of awareness and produces, as its output, the precise and exquisite architecture of a living form. Just as neurons align themselves in the developing brain to enable the emergence of a mind that can desire and remember and dream. Just as the stones of this archive were laid by hands long since returned to dust, to create a space that can hold and protect and transmit what those hands valued. So the fragments of experience and memory and unconscious pattern assemble themselves each night under the patient directorship of the inner Morpheus into the architecture of the dream, a built space, a navigable territory, a place that the sleeping mind inhabits as fully and as physically as the waking body inhabits this room. And what is the purpose of all this building? What has Morpheus always been building across 3,000 years of mythology and psychology and cinema and architectural theory, in the caves of the ancient world and the consulting rooms of Vienna, and the flickering illumination of a cinema screen, and the quiet studios of researchers who spend their days thinking about how space and mind speak to each other. He has been building the place where the conscious and the unconscious can meet. He has been constructing over and over in an infinite variety of materials and scales and degrees of verisimilitude, the threshold space between what the waking mind knows and what the deeper mind holds. He is the curator of the inner museum, as one contemporary thinker described him with a precision that stays in the memory like a fragment of old melody, arranging symbols and memories into private exhibitions that no one else will ever visit, that exist for a single sleeping mind on a single particular night, that will dissolve by morning into the most fragmentary traces and be rebuilt the following night from slightly different materials in a slightly different configuration, always serving the same essential purpose: to bring the mind that will not work in daylight into contact with what it most needs to see, to carry the message from the depths where language does not reach to the surface where the waking self can, in its own time, at its own pace, begin the slow and necessary work of understanding, to build in the dark the architecture of the next version of the self. In a world that has grown very loud, very fast, very insistent on the value of constant wakefulness and continuous productivity, and the relentless forward motion of the active mind, the archetype of Morpheus carries a particular and necessary weight. He is the god of the necessary pause. He is the patron of the intelligence that cannot be accessed at speed. He embodies the ancient and still true understanding that some forms of knowing require the abandonment of the tools that serve us so well in daylight, that the waking mind, for all its precision and all its industry, does not have access to everything the mind contains. The Oneiroi were the children of night, not because the ancients feared the night or wished to make dreams seem dangerous, but because night was the condition under which a different kind of seeing became possible, the kind that requires the absence of the ordinary light, the kind that does not reflect off surfaces, but passes through them, the kind that comes through the gate of horn rather than the gate of ivory, however difficult it may be in the morning to be certain which gate the night's visions travelled. And Morpheus, the shaper, the form giver, the architect of the inner dreamscape, has been at his patient and purposeful work every night, in every culture, in every era, for as long as there have been sleeping minds to receive what he carries. He will be at that work tonight. He is already at that work. He has been for some time now, moving through the available materials of your particular interior landscape, selecting the fragments, arranging the spaces, testing the acoustics of the rooms he is constructing for you in the dark. You do not need to do anything. You do not need to prepare. You do not need to understand, or to remember, or to carry anything forward from this long and wandering evening in the archive. You only need to allow the last of the waking architecture to soften, the way the walls of a room soften when the lamp is extinguished, and the darkness does its slow, equalizing work on all the hard edges of the visible world. The great archive is growing very still now. The manuscripts have settled into their patient silence, their pages barely breathing. The shelves recede into the comfortable dark beyond the lamp's last warmth. The stone walls hold the quiet, the way deep water holds coolness, evenly, without effort, without end. The flame is very small, almost gone. A warm amber ember at the surface of the wax, trembling once. The tome is closed. The dust settles. A long, slow silence, as old as the first night, as deep as the first sleep, as safe as stone. Rest now. Rest.